David checked his brokerage app the way he did most Sundays, half out of habit, half out of boredom, expecting the same unremarkable number he'd been seeing for years. This time something was different, not dramatically, not with any fanfare, but the year-over-year gain sitting in small gray text below his balance was larger than the total amount he'd contributed that entire year. He read it twice, assuming he'd misunderstood the math. He hadn't. Somewhere in the previous 12 months, without any specific action on his part, his money had quietly crossed a line most people never notice crossing at all. My name is Emory, and if you've ever wondered whether there's an actual identifiable point where investing stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like momentum, a specific moment rather than a vague, gradual feeling, then this video should help pinpoint exactly what that moment is and why it happens where it does. And if that's useful to you, sticking around and subscribing helps this channel keep finding the precise mechanisms hiding inside financial concepts. Most people think compounding is a smooth, continuous process that gradually feels more rewarding over time, a steadily rising curve with no distinct turning point. They're completely wrong, and the reason matters, because there is an exact, calculable moment where the mechanism shifts character entirely. The moment when a single year of investment growth exceeds a full year of new contributions, and everything about how the money behaves changes on the other side of that line. To understand why this specific moment matters so much, it helps to walk through what's actually happening in the years before it. In the earliest years of consistent investing, growth is real but small, easily overshadowed by the size of ongoing contributions. Someone contributing $500 a month ends year one with $6,000 contributed, and perhaps $200 of growth on top, a number so much smaller than the contribution itself that it barely registers as a distinct force at all. This is the phase that behaves like learning an instrument, technically developing but not yet loud enough to feel like progress. And it's precisely the phase where most people either quit or stop paying close attention, mistaking invisible progress for no progress at all. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting, because the mathematics of compound growth guarantee that this ratio between contributions and growth doesn't stay fixed. It shifts steadily and predictably in one direction, as the account balance grows large enough for a fixed percentage return to produce a larger dollar amount than the contributions themselves. At a typical long-term return of 7% annually, and monthly contributions of $500, this crossover point arrives with remarkable consistency somewhere between year 11 and year 13, depending slightly on exact contribution timing and market performance in any given year. Before this point, someone is primarily building their own wealth through effort. After this point, the account itself becomes the primary source of new growth, with contributions playing an increasingly secondary role. Someone might reasonably ask why this specific crossover deserves to be called a distinct moment, rather than simply a gradual continuation of the same process. It's a fair question, and the honest answer is that the underlying mechanism genuinely does change character at this point, not just in degree but in kind. Before the crossover, an investor's own behavior, consistency, contribution size is the dominant variable determining how quickly the account grows. After the crossover, market performance in any given year starts to matter more than the investor's own monthly contribution, meaning the investor's relationship to their own money genuinely shifts from primary driver to supporting contributor, even though nothing about their contribution habits needs to change at all. This connects to something worth naming precisely: the shift from linear to compounding dominance. In the years before the crossover, the account's growth curve looks nearly linear, almost indistinguishable from simply adding up contributions with a small bonus attached. In the years after, the curve begins visibly bending upward, not because contributions increased, but because a fixed percentage applied to a steadily larger base produces steadily larger absolute numbers, even without any change in behavior. This is the exact mathematical signature of compounding becoming the dominant force in the equation, rather than merely a background contributor to it. Someone might reasonably ask whether this crossover point is the same for everyone, since contribution amounts and time horizons vary enormously between different people's situations. It's a fair concern, and the honest answer is that the crossover moves earlier or later based on two specific variables: contribution size relative to starting balance and the rate of return achieved. Someone contributing a smaller amount relative to their portfolio, or someone who started with a larger initial lump sum, will cross this threshold earlier, sometimes within just a few years, while someone contributing a larger amount relative to a small starting balance will take longer to reach the same crossover, sometimes 15 years or more. The specific number of years matters less than understanding that the crossover exists at all, and that it's calculable in advance for any specific contribution pattern and expected return. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting a second time, because what happens to psychology and behavior around this crossover deserves just as much attention as the math itself. In the years leading up to this point, most investors experience something close to monotonous discipline, contributing consistently without much visible reward, sustained largely by trust in a process rather than by observable results. In the years following the crossover, the emotional experience shifts meaningfully. The account starts producing visible, noticeable jumps that feel disconnected from any specific action taken that month, which for many people marks the first time investing feels less like an obligation and more like an active, ongoing process working independently of their direct effort. Someone might reasonably ask what happens to this dynamic during a market downturn, since the entire premise of accelerating growth assumes generally positive returns. It's a fair concern, and the honest part of the answer is that this crossover effect works in both directions once triggered. A larger account experiencing a downturn loses more in absolute dollar terms than a smaller account would, even at the identical percentage decline. This isn't a flaw in the mechanism. It's the same amplification effect that produces the accelerated growth in the first place, simply running in reverse during a bad year. The reason this doesn't undermine the overall strategy is that market downturns are historically temporary, while the compounding mechanism itself operates over a much longer horizon, meaning a single bad year after the crossover typically gets absorbed by several good years surrounding it, rather than derailing the long-term trajectory entirely. By the time this same pattern extends several years past the initial crossover, the effect compounds on itself in a way worth walking through directly. Continuing the earlier example, by year 20, total contributions sit around $120,000, while growth has compounded to roughly $145,000, meaning growth has not only caught up to contributions but meaningfully surpassed them, producing more value from doing essentially nothing than from an entire 2 decades of active saving. By year 30, contributions total $180,000, while growth reaches somewhere near $470,000, a gap so wide that the original monthly contribution, once the primary driver of the entire plan, now represents a small fraction of what's actually building the account's value. Someone might reasonably ask what practical difference this crossover point should make in how someone actually manages their investments day to day. It's worth being honest that the answer isn't to change behavior dramatically once this point arrives. The same consistent contribution and the same hands-off approach that got someone to the crossover remain exactly the right approach afterward as well. What changes isn't the strategy, it's the appropriate emotional relationship to the account. Before the crossover, patience is the primary requirement, while after it, patience remains just as necessary, but it's now joined by a kind of quiet confidence that the mechanism has visibly demonstrated its own momentum, rather than requiring continued faith alone. So if the actual question is when compounding becomes a wealth machine rather than simply a savings habit, the honest answer is a specific, calculable moment, the year when investment growth first exceeds annual contributions, typically arriving somewhere in the second decade of consistent investing for a typical contributor. The math doesn't require noticing this exact moment for it to happen, and it doesn't punish someone for missing it either. It simply keeps working exactly the same way before and after. The only thing that changes is which force, effort, or momentum happens to be doing more of the work in any given year.